All right.
Fire away.
Welcome, everyone. So tonight we have an agenda that we're going to be talking about a couple of different things. I'm just going to go over the agenda real quick for anybody who doesn't have one, but we have a little bit of a topic, a little bit of discussion on the continuing work that we're doing on the short-term rental licensing ordinance. We have several draft warrant articles to address some land use related ideas that we've talked about a little bit in the past, but these are just the start of the warrant articles. We don't have a lot of anything to deal with subdivision tonight. And then the other items I'd love to add to the list are really want to just brainstorm about setting public hearing dates for all these things that we're working on. And one thing that we do need to discuss, or this committee needs to discuss, is electing a chair and making sure that we're getting the right documentation. So taking better minutes and updating for the Board of Selectmen's reports, I guess. So that's what we have. That work for everybody on the Zoom? Yeah, I think we have on Zoom for the committee members. I see Jerry, I see Dave, and Stephanie. I see Stephanie. And that's it. And then here we have Rick, Kim, Noel, and Derlin, and two members in the audience whose names I don't know.
Ann Walmsley and Robert Walmsley.
There you go. Hi, Ann and Robert. All right. Does that work for you guys? Good. Can you just take down the list? So we have a bunch of work to do. I'm just going to hit agenda topic number one. I thought taking a lot of the discussion from the last meeting, we're continuing to work on updating the ordinance. There's a bunch of things that we should probably talk about that came out of that. I didn't think that there was going to be a bunch of committee members here tonight anyway, based on what we knew for attendance. So I don't think we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that tonight. We have other things that we have to deal with as well. So, but we are continuing to work on the short-term rental ordinance. I know a lot of people are interested in that and continuing to try to make the edits that people are suggesting, and we'll keep working on it. That okay with everyone? Looking on Zoom. You'll decide. It's good. All right.
Noel.
Yeah.
This is Dave. Because I own a short-term rental, should I recuse myself? I get there's been some discussion about that.
I will let Derlin answer that question, but based on what Andy said, the other.
Yes, David, you should. We haven't actually got the code of conduct policy before the board yet. That won't probably come to the next meeting. I'm planning on having that, but it's a very good idea, I think, to recuse on that, because there is at least the perception of a conflict there if you have a short-term rental.
Might I just add that, having read what the town's attorney had submitted with regard issues of conflict of interest and the perception of conflict of interest, there is also the matter of, unless there is a pecuniary value to be gained in participating in this process, which there isn't, then one need only disclose and make it known that they are a renter, just as Mr. Musson did back in our first meeting, which I did when I announced that I am part owner of Hall Quarry Rentals LLC, just to let people know that everything, it's about transparency, basically. And if somebody has an issue, they can bring it forward, and then that person can recuse themselves based on that. But to simply recuse yourself because you have a rental, to me, is akin to, if you own land, you can't be on the planning board. So
that's good point. Yeah. So I would be fine with that, I think.
Yeah, and I feel the same way. I think it would be very unfortunate to not have the knowledge and experience that Rick and I and Katrina and other people can bring to the table.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we can continue to have that discussion and then seek some clarity a little bit too, Dave, and Rick and Derlin, even before January. January's meeting, just to make sure we're all doing what we're supposed to do. But we have a lot of notes and sort of working through some of the suggested edits and then continuing to do our due diligence as planning consultants about, you know, the topic of short-term rental, what it is that the town of Mount Desert is really trying to get out of this particular proposal. And there's a few questions that I do think it would be worthwhile to have like a lengthier discussion about when there are more people involved. I would also advocate for, you know, we're going to have a draft. This topic deserves a more, you know, public hearing style discussions. And so when Kim and I were talking about just prepping for some stuff, like I think it's probably going to be in the January, early February timeframe, where we're going to at least be on the planning board agenda to have our, you know, public hearings related to that. So I would say we're penciling in first meeting or second meeting in January, which is
25th.
the 25th, and then the 2 meetings in February for public hearings.
So the 25th January would be to update the planning board on
Yep.
the proposals going forward or being proposed for the annual town meeting of 2023. And then February 8th would be the first meeting in February. Would that also be updated public hearing on the 22nd?
Yep.
So the board will have 2 opportunities to review the proposals and make changes, but on the 22nd, no changes.
Yeah. My thinking is that some of these, like there's probably 10, I'm going to say there's 10 warrant articles that are basically just, here's a you know, we need to change the date here or make some minor tweaks, which are pretty straightforward. But there's a couple things that we might be talking about, and short-term rental ordinance is one of them, that I would like to, I think just put it out there a little bit more for discussion, and then have the ability to make changes between meetings without having to feel like we need to scrap the whole thing if it gets to that point. So that's the plan. And we'll be having these meetings, which are also open to the public. So we should also hopefully get some good comments there. So I would say for everybody on the Zoom and in the audience who are here for short-term rentals, we are going to be working on updating the draft, and we can have that out in advance of the January meeting, and that we could either send Kim an email or send me an email. I can send it to you in advance of the meeting, so you can look at it. But things that I want to discuss, just to kind of prep, a couple of prep discussions. Like last time we talked about owner occupied residential accommodations being exempt from the ordinance. And I think it would be interesting to have a continual conversation about whether or not, since this is a registration ordinance, you know, and we're trying to get data primarily, you know, whether or not it would be worth continuing to keep that in the ordinance as something that needs to just get registered. So things like that. Does that work?
Yep. I was not at the last meeting, so I do have one comment that hopefully can get incorporated into draft.
Yep.
I'm concerned about the timeliness of if there's going to be inspections, the timeliness of the inspections. If somebody's got a property rented, and then the inspection takes place shortly before the tenants are going to arrive, and there are defects that need to be corrected, are we going to give a grace period for that? Or and I'm not asking about that for myself, because my property was inspected by Kim and I've got an occupancy permit, but I'm talking about the older properties that have never been inspected. I'm just worried about the people that you know, that need to make changes and maybe have to make them quickly.
Yep, good comment, Dave. I have to go back and read to see what we actually said about inspections, and I'll keep that as a note. All right, and I also did want to bring up that we've done, I should say, Callie from my office has done quite a bit of research. When we first started talking about this, the issue of how to administer the short-term rental ordinances and those kinds of things came up. And we said we were going to do some work to just try to identify like what resources are available out there for the town to consider if you wanted to subcontract out to somebody to do some administrative work. We have a report at the beginning of the year. We'll go over it with Darwin and then see where we go from there. But it's just, you know, we've identified a couple of different companies that do this kind of work, and it might be something you want to consider depending on how this thing shakes out. So that's out there. Okay. Good.
Yeah, I just, uninformed question. We don't have any current inspection requirement before leasing properties, do we?
I don't think so.
No, we don't
No.
regulate them.
And is there
Right
one
now.
proposed now?
Well, I think one of the items that was under discussion when it first started in terms of any licensing or inspection requirement, which would bring on an incredible amount of work for our code enforcement officer, is that it might be necessary to have an inspection prior to the issuance of a license. But that doesn't mean there's an ongoing inspection every year or every 5 years. Might be every 5 years, who knows?
But is there a license required to rent?
Not right now.
So, okay.
No, in fact, it's wide open.
Right.
This proposed ordinance is to endeavor to bring rentals into a format that is regulated and serves a purpose to alleviate any problem that might exist. And as I said before, we're not even sure the nature or extent of that problem at this point. And that's why we're in the data collection phase. We want as much information as we can before we, as I said, create a solution to a problem that doesn't exist.
Yeah, I will say the town's updating its you're getting ready to update its comprehensive plan. We still need to kind of get a comp plan committee together and do all that good stuff. So there's a lot of issues that are happening that are island-wide issues as well. Like housing is the big issue. It's housing, year-round housing, it's housing affordability, it's housing seasonal worker housing. And then one of the things of many things that short-term rentals starts to trigger is a question of affordability and how it takes, how those units may or may not take, you know, housing units off the market so that they're not available for year-round housing and stuff like that. So that's part of the analysis. But I think one of the questions that the town's trying to answer first and foremost, without a heavy regulatory structure at this point, is what is the extent of rentals. It's just identifying the what this ordinance does is sets up a very, I'd say, base level life safety requirement, and really gives the town the ability to understand how many there are, what kind they are, what number of, how many bedrooms might be affected by it, and then where in the community they are, because there are different impacts, you know, from a land use perspective that need to be considered when you start thinking about these. But it's just like the first, you know, it's just a registration ordinance. I can't
First inning.
I'm not even sure how to describe it any more. It's a really pretty simple thing to a very complex problem. Yeah, that's how I think about it. It's really interesting, but I will continue to say, like, when we're talking about this issue, that this is one thing among many other bigger issues that we have to deal with on MDI related to housing. Essentially, it's like I think about it like, if you think about housing as a pie, this is one slice in the pie. There's like 1,000. There's like a bunch of other slices we need to kind of pick away at, and this is one of them. And it's also quite emotional, the topic. So that's
Yeah.
very interesting as well to try to navigate. So that's where we are. Anyway, I don't mean to belabor it, but I think that there's a lot of stuff to talk about, and January is a good jumping off point for that as well. So we have a few edits that we need to make a little more thoughtfully before January to the current draft. Good. All set? All right, moving on. Next thing on the list. Let's see, I'm just gonna randomly pick the first one on my list of the ordinances that we've done. So right now, I think Kim and I had sat down a month or two ago, at least, to go over, as we do every year, just as Kim applies the ordinance, things kind of pop up. And our mission, one of the missions of the Land Use Ordinance Committee, when it first got started, was to help to try to clarify and simplify the ordinance as much as we can to make it more user-friendly and usable. So this is along those lines as well, trying to keep making edits as necessary. So the first one, I'm not going to pick that one first. We'll deal with that one in a minute.
That's why I put it
last. Yeah. All right. The first one on my list was, we had talked about this before, but the conditional use approval, once approved, currently you only have the deadline for establishing the use is only 12 months. And we have talked about making it 24 months. So I think our observation is that it takes longer to establish a project once it's approved these days than 12 months. So we just want to give people a little extra time. So this particular amendment changes it from 12 to 24 months. Any questions from the audience, either in person or online? Hearing none. Moving on. The next one I have is related to the ordinance currently has 6B2 in the ordinance actually has a provision for air landing sites. Currently, air landing sites aren't even in the allowed uses table. And I think the idea is to take them out. And rather than renumber the whole 6B section, I just put reserve under 6B2 in case we want to use it again and not have to renumber the whole rest of the ordinance. So right now we're just deleting air landing sites from the ordinance. And I did do
status, they're not, it's not a permitted.
It's not even a permitted use. Yeah.
And there's not really any in the town of Mount Desert.
Yeah. I did actually do a word search to make sure there were no other references to air landing sites, and I couldn't find any. So, any questions?
What does that preclude air flight coming in and lifting people out?
I don't think so. That's an emergency scenario. I think this would be like if you wanted to do an air landing site, you have to go to the planning board and get a conditional use approval, which you wouldn't want to, you know, in the event of an emergency, hopefully. So you missed the deadline. You can't meet the planning board application. All right. Moving on. The next one I have is to clarify that currently road setbacks are measured in two different ways. So under a for public roads, the setback is measured from the edge of the road surface or the edge of the right of way if the road doesn't exist. And private roads are actually measured from the property line. So in reading the ordinance, sometimes it's a little unclear whether or not particularly for the private roads, you're supposed to measure from. And this change basically just tries to clarify that. So it just separates out the two ordinances, the two provisions in a little more specificity.
Can I ask a question on this?
Yes, please.
The setback from a private road or right of way still has to meet the setback requirement as it would from a property line as far as the side and the rear. Up in the roadway, you're saying that now when you measure from a private road to develop from the roadway, you got to know where your property line is and measure from there. And it's still equal to the setback of what the property line setback is. It's not what the public, because public and private have in the ordinance have two different setbacks.
Yes. So the first thing, I think what this is trying to do is not change the rule, but to clarify what is meant by the rule, right? So the first one is the setback from a public road is measured from the edge of the road surface.
Right,
or
and
the
usually
edge
is
of
a deeper setback requirement from a public road
Yep.
in
And then-
the ordinance. And then from a private road, you're no longer saying you could go from the edge of the road surface like you would a public road, because you'll have a less of a setback because it'd be equal to the side and rear set.
Yeah.
So now you're saying it's got to go from the property line.
Right, which is what I think the rule already says. I think that's what we discussed needing to change, but if that's not correct, then let's make it.
Well, I've always interpreted it and always enforced it, that it's no different from a public for a private where you measure from. It's just that from a private road, your setback is equal to what the property line setback is, which is less than from a private. But now it's changing to now say you've got to go from the property line on a public road, on a private road in versus from the edge of the road in.
So what should it say?
But I've been enforcing from the edge of the road similar to what it says on the public road.
Okay,
But now it's changing.
so should we be saying anything different than what I'm,
Well, that's not how I've been interpreting it.
okay,
But now you're changing it to now say that it's instead of going from the edge of the road surface
mhm,
on a private road, which you can on a public road, you're now saying that it now has to be measured from where their property line is in.
oh, I see. So you're just saying if the way you interpret it now is if it's a private road and the setback were 25 feet, you're measuring 25 feet from the traveled way.
From the edge of the
not
road in, not from the property line.
Okay, so that's how we should be writing it.
And that's how I've been interpreting it.
Okay,
Because there's an inherent problem with every right of way that bisects a piece of property. If you measure from the property line up to the right of way, and then that a building or structure could be 3 feet from the right of way, as long as they're 25 feet from their property line. You know what I mean?
So, yeah, and so I'm just trying to make sure this is not how it's enforced. It's enforced the same from a public and a private road to me, how I've been doing it,
Should be from the edge of the road.
which is the edge of the road surface in. The setbacks though from a property line are less than they would be from a public road. So from a public road, typically it's either 50 or 60 feet or even 30 in some of the zones. And the property line setbacks either are 10, 15,
mhm. I see. what you're saying.
25.
It's just
20,
the
right?
point at which you measure is always the traveled way.
That's how I've enforced this. And that's how I interpreted this to be. In the past, it used to be, this has been changed, I think, twice since I've been here. Before it used to be from the edge of the right of way. Which actually, regardless if it's public or private, and that way, if somebody had a 60-foot setback, a lot of people couldn't develop in the front of their property because that setback was so deep.
Yep.
So therefore, we changed it to go to the edge of the road surface.
Right.
And then we changed it from that all, instead of measuring public or private didn't matter at the time, but now we've changed private to be what the setbacks are from the side and rear property lines.
Yep. I think I get it.
Okay.
All right, I will make a modification to that for sure.
Okay.
Any questions? Everybody follow that? Yeah.
Sorry if I complicated.
No. think you actually tried to describe that when we were talking to Andy about it, and
I did.
still didn't get it.
There's a typo in there.
What? Unbelievable.
The setback from a private roads or private right of way.
Got it. Thank you. It's also all going to change.
I know.
Thank you.
All right.
Good catch, Jerry.
Nice one. All right, so the next one is, I really, some of these are also quite a bit for discussion, but a couple of years ago, the town added an exemption or a provision in the ordinance that allowed for each dwelling unit on a single lot within a village commercial district to have 1,000 square foot minimum lot size, as long as it's served by public water and meets the minimum lot area required, blah, blah, blah. So there's multiple village commercial districts in town. So this is like one of those scenarios. Try to make a good change for really it was intended, I think, for the village in Northeast Harbor. And then because the way the ordinance is structured, you know, village commercial districts are all the same, but they're located in different places in town, even though a lot of places in town have totally different characteristics. So I think the conversation has been, do we want to make a change to just specify that this 1,000 square foot, you know, lot area really only applies to Northeast Harbor and not other village commercial districts. So I'm really just kind of throwing that out there for discussion more than.
Well, I kind of can explain a little bit on this. I dealt with somebody looking to buy a certain property in Soamesville that was in the village commercial zoning district, and the lot was going to be just over 2 acres. And they wanted to know if they could, how many dwelling units technically they could have on the property. And with this footnote, it ended up being close to 93, I believe it was. So it didn't make, so that's why I raised a red flag to Noel about this, that maybe we should designate it into the area that it was intended to, which I believe was Northeast Harbor. But we do have village commercial districts in Soamesville, Seal Harbor, and Northeast Harbor. And we also have it in 2 places in Northeast Harbor. We have it up in Sylvan City. And then we have it here in town. And I'm not sure if you want to, where you want to limit that, if you want to include Sylvan City as well. But there's a lot of houses up there, but it all depends on, you know, density and lot coverage and stuff like that, but people could always go up. So I guess that's something to think about and discuss.
Yeah, and I would preface all this by saying, this is not to say that a higher density isn't appropriate in any of the other village commercial areas. I just think that if I recall, the conversation was specific to Northeast Harbor, and we've been having more village specific meetings in advance of the comprehensive plan. And I think that it would be wise to think about each of these villages individually and then come back and say, yeah, we do need to change the density in Seal Harbor, for example, to help accommodate more year-round housing. Or maybe Soamesville doesn't want to change their commercial area, like this is a
And I
kind
think,
of a bigger deal.
I think that was part of the discussion too, when we were talking specifically about Northeast Harbor.
Yeah.
Because there was an issue of housing disappearing, basically. And it already exists where, if you look at the majority of the homes in where it's very dense, they are on a minimum lot of 1,000 square feet. So it makes sense to codify that and say, yeah, we don't, you know, you're not going to put something on a 500 square foot lot, but 1,000's the minimum.
Right.
And that works for Northeast Harbor, but someplace else, like you said, a 2 acre lot, you're talking 93 dwellings.
Well, and I mean, what I've learned, what I think was one of the interesting outcomes of the village planning meetings was a lot of people did say, hey, we should have more, like the zoning should be more specific to our village because we have, you know, unique needs here that aren't necessarily met by this big broad brush. And so again, the thing that we're trying to balance is keeping the ordinance, you know, simple and user friendly, but also meeting the needs of the town more consistently. I would say that the more iterative, thoughtful approach might be to think about it like specific to the village as opposed to this. And I think if we went back to the records, it would really be, this conversation was very much focused on Northeast Harbor and not any place else. It was.
How does that? How does that affect somebody in Otter Creek or Somerville that says, well, this applies in Northeast Harbor, but it doesn't apply to me. Why can't it?
Well, I think that would be what I'm suggesting is I'm not saying it isn't necessarily appropriate. I'm not saying it's not appropriate in other places. I'm saying we've never really had the conversation to determine if it was appropriate in other places. So we should be having that conversation. I'm not making a judgment call on whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think we need to be more specific and kind of follow through with what we started with these village planning meetings, which is to say, here's what we learned. Let's have some more discussions with the residents of those areas about the code that needs to be created to meet the needs of that village. I don't think this does. It's a pretty broad brush, but that's just it's really not up to me. I'm just pointing it out as a point of discussion for tonight. So I'll take guidance from anybody.
Lot coverage
doesn't answer your question.
I mean, lot coverage will play a part. Distance between buildings will play a part too. We know housing is a need. But like I say, this specific lot, 93, granted, I don't think they're going to be able to put 93 and have the lot coverage and the separation, but that was just a calculation on what could this lot, what could it provide? And I was just like, oh my God, I don't know if this is really what we meant, but yeah, that was my answer.
And maybe just to throw this out there, perhaps this is really also just a good placeholder to have that conversation at public meetings that we have scheduled in January and February and see what other people think. You know, if everybody that comes to the meeting says, oh yeah, no, this is great, then we just pull it off the list.
This only applies to a village commercial district, right?
Right.
Correct. That work for everybody? Yep, I'm looking at Jerry. And see if they have any comments. All right.
I'm practicing not commenting.
Okay. Well, again, it's not up to me. I think it's interesting. I think it's a worthwhile discussion to have with the town. So that's the only reason I put it on here. Well, that's one of the reasons I put it on here.
My issue is just that as you get more specific for each town, it's going to expand. We're going to have to write a separate individual one for each town to discuss minimums.
Maybe. I guess what I'm saying is that it's worth having continuing the discussions that we had from some of these individual village meetings to determine what changes, if any, are necessary to make them more consistent with what people want that village to be and may currently be. So like I'll continue to use Steel Harbor as a good example. Like even in Steel Harbor, the core of Steel Harbor, those buildings probably could not even be rebuilt. It's the same problem that we had with Northeast Harbor after the fires. Like those buildings can't be rebuilt without a change to the code because they're too close together and too close to the street in a lot of cases. So we'd have to do something specific for that village anyway. But I mean, to me, that's like part of the conversation. So, and then the trick, which we obviously haven't figured out yet, and I think part of what you're alluding to is trying to do that in a way that doesn't make the ordinance go from like this to this. But I've said this before, sometimes lack of specificity makes things more complicated. So having a little more detail isn't always a bad thing. Okay, but I'm gonna keep it on the list for now.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. The next one I had on the list was under 6B11, there's a date. And I think it was, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, but we had to make some changes to the ordinance. See a formatting problem.
Do that too.
We had to make a change to the ordinance related to access. It might have been last year, at last year's town.
There's that special town meeting.
Yeah, and we made a change to the ordinance to allow more clarity and flexibility, I think, in terms of how you are able to access a lot and by which date you have to do certain things for access. And the date that we had originally was June 6th. And that's what's in the ordinance of 2015, but it really should have been June or May 5th. And I think that had to do with when there was a town meeting versus a special town meeting or something like that.
Yeah, no, this was, this town meeting was continued
Yeah,
from May 5th to June 9th or 6th. But May 5th is when this was voted on.
right.
So that's, we had to put it the right date.
It
We
really-
just had the wrong date.
Yeah, it really should just be May 5th. That's the correct date. So we're just correcting the date from last year.
And
basically.
this is when we took away the minimum width of road requirements on a lot to
Right.
create the access provision
Back in March.
back in no,
Oh, back in
initially back in
2015.
2015.
Yep, that's the date. That's the reason why we picked that date. But this is the one where
So
you
it's
know,
just a
there's a bunch of lots. in
Just the
under
date
there that
change.
have-
date change.
Yeah,
Is
That's
it?
it.
that's pretty much it.
Yeah, nothing else changes in it.
All right. Questions on that? Okay, hearing none. All right, so the other one, back to 6B11, I have a couple of different things that we need to try to accomplish here. The first one is under 6B11(3). These are requirements for lots that are outside of the shoreline zone. I haven't made a change here, but we do need to discuss whether any clarity is required for lots that are abutting more than one road. And I think it could be a little unclear that where the setback is measured from, if your entrance is on one road, but your lot is like, if you have a lot with frontage on one road and another road, if you enter one side, that's your front setback. And if you don't
Which would
enter
be
the
your
other
road
side,
setback.
that's your road setback
And
versus.
then the other one would be your side.
Wherever your driveway is.
Yeah.
That would be your, that would how
Your
you
road
take
setback.
access to your lot. So then this would be your front, even though you have a road over here, this would be like a side and a rear.
Yeah, and so Mount Desert doesn't have like
We don't have front and rear
front,
set.
rear.
that
and side
defines-
setbacks. It's just property line and road. So one of them would be a lot bigger than the other.
So like, again, public and private, if somebody takes access off a private road, even though there's a deeper setback from a public road, it would be considered a side setback, so it'd be less of the setback from that
Right.
public road. Because this is how they take access off the private road, or vice versa.
So you may add some clarity. I probably would put this as a separate warrant article, just so as not to confuse people, but I just kept it.
Well, Andy said we don't even have to really change it if it's agreed upon, that's how you interpret this.
Well, it's clear to me how to interpret it, but you're the one that has.
I know, I was the one that raised it, because I am dealing with a lot that has two fronts, or excuse me, two roads. And one is a public and one is a private, but they take access from their lot off the private road, so. I was asking, do they still have to meet the setback, the deeper setback from the public road, because it abuts a public road? But he said, no, it's how you take access would be how you read this. So I just wanted to make sure I was interpreting it right, that's all.
Yep,
And it sounds like I was kind of out of YouTube, you and Andy, I was wrong. I mean, I was
you're not wrong.
doing it right, but it was just I wasn't sure if it needed clarity, but apparently it doesn't. Okay, thank you.
All right, so that might come out. The next one is 6B11(3)(2), which is also related to the exemption. So currently, the town of Mount Desert allows for additional 1-family or 2-family dwellings on each lot. And if you have a 1-family dwelling or 2-family dwelling, for every additional, so it's like a single family house or a duplex, basically, just to clarify. Every time you add one more of those, you have to meet the dimensional standards ×2. So if you have one house and you want to build a second one, you have to meet the dimensional standards for each dwelling unit. And if you have one duplex and then you want to add a second duplex, you have to meet the dimensional standards for each duplex, not dwelling unit. And this, for this change, it just kind of clarifies. It's a little confusing in the ordinance whether or not you can add multiple duplexes and when the dimensional standards ×2 kick in. So I'm just trying to help. I need to work on it a little bit, but this change will basically be just to clarify the current thinking and practice, which is for every additional dwelling unit you have on your lot, you have to have all the dimensional standards need to be met ×2. And for every additional duplex you have to meet the dimensional standards.
Is that how you read that?
I'm wondering if this is how it's actually written, or do we need to clean up this language?
It says and or two different areas.
In the middle of that paragraph, all dimensional requirements shall be met separately for each 2-family on a 2-family dwelling on a lot. Is that a sentence?
Well, it should read, all dimensional requirements shall be met separately for each 2-family dwellings on a lot. Yeah, no, I have to modify that. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Noel, can I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah, I'm just curious. So I don't see a lot of duplexes around Northeast Harbor, but I know that this new proposal from MD 365 is going to put a couple duplexes on the Heald property. So I'm just curious, what this ordinance means for that property. Is that why this ordinance is coming up, or is this just it seems coincidental because you don't really see a ton of duplexes around?
Yeah, this doesn't change that at all. And it's really the only purpose of this, this discussion is to clarify what's already common practice. Whether or not we actually need to clarify it, I'm not sure, but it really has nothing to do with MB 365's proposal.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. It's that this is currently how the town interprets it. And then actually, if we didn't clarify it, I think it would be more easy to get more units, wouldn't it? If you did it in the other way. Anyway, currently you're able to, this is what you're currently able to do. And I just need to clarify the language a little bit. So I'm trying to separate out the sentences.
It's just
And
weird the way it's written.
With real words.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The additional is the key word.
Right. I think the idea in Mount Desert's always been you can have a duplex and you treat the duplex the same as you would a single family unit because they're attached.
Right. And then an additional one on top.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions from the?
Well, it is, so does this mean there really is no single family zoning?
No, there's
You can do a duplex anywhere.
Yeah.
So if it's zoned single
It's
family,
one, yeah.
it's really not single family, it's single family or duplex.
Right.
Well, it's under 1 and 2 family dwellings are under the same umbrella.
And it's zoned under residential, not 1-family or 2-family structures.
But to your point, if you said I have a 2-acre lot in Hull Quarry and I want to, is that single family dwelling in traditional, is that a single family zoning in like a traditional sense? That probably not, because this provision applies, or the exemption that the town put in place, which is right underneath that several years ago, where they decided that it was okay for lots outside the shoreline zone to add 1 accessory dwelling unit to your lot without meeting the
Dimensional requirements
dimensional
×2.
times 2.
So in the past, before we added this exemption, if you had a 2-acre lot and it's 2-acre zoning, you would need 4 acres to have 2 houses on it. But we had put in an exception to allow for one accessory residential dwelling unit if you meet the minimum lot size. But we did cap the size of the second dwelling to 75% of the size of the living area of the main house. Without having to meet dimensional requirements times two.
Right. Yeah. So today, if you lived in a 2-acre area, if I wanted to add a second full-size dwelling unit, I'd have to have 4 acres. But if I wanted to add a slightly smaller second dwelling unit, I don't have to have, I just have 2 acres. So the idea was, we're starting to think about accessory dwelling units and, in-law apartments and those kinds of things to help with some of that. So that triggers the next discussion, which is just to clarify, what I think the intent was of the ordinance is that you really only get one accessory dwelling unit per lot and not multiple accessory dwelling units per lot. So that's another change we might add. And then there's something called LD 2003, which is a state law that just passed and it's getting modified and clarified. Yep.
We already did the one accessory residential dwelling unit last year.
You did?
Yep. For any existing or new lot that is wholly outside the shoreline zone, one accessory residential dwelling unit is allowed per lot without the increase in the minimum lot size requirement. We did that last year.
Well, then what was the thing that we had to talk about that was clarity for that? That was in my notes.
There wasn't anything on that. It was
just
this.
the one above.
Yeah, just the one above. Because see, if you look at what under your exception, you have it there.
I got it. See it. Thank you.
Yeah. I wondered why you had that in there again, but
yeah, because I had it in my notes that we had to deal with it.
Yeah. Sorry, you continue. My bad.
No, that's it. Anyway, LB 2003 is coming to all the towns, and we're going to have to deal with it at some point. I think when we were discussing it with the town's attorney, the idea that we are actually working on a comprehensive, or the town is working on a comprehensive plan update, and we're going to make some adjustments based on that, and then work on how we integrate it into the ordinance. So we're not dealing with it this year.
Yeah, that's the law that Janet Mills
Yep.
signed in,
Yep.
but it's gone back to the table, if you will.
Yep.
Because it affects way too many towns that cannot put this into their ordinances and meet. Because they just don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the lots, it's too small of towns or city, but. So I don't know what's coming back, but that is back on the drawing board again, my understanding.
Yeah.
But we are kind of somewhat compliant by adding the accessory residential dwelling unit ahead of this.
Right.
I think it's a really interesting provision. It deals with growth areas and what you can and can't do in growth areas. It's a really complex and could have a lot of impacts that we need to think about.
Interesting document.
Yes. If anybody's interested, there's a good guidance document.
I have it, I can send it.
Yeah.
Kim has it. I have a copy of it. If anybody wants
to
it,
me.
we sent it out. Yep. So it's interesting. Every town is going to have to deal with it. So, and it's the whole purpose is to deal with housing.
Do you know if the shoreline zoning has?
I haven't actually looked lately. One of these, probably next year, we should go through shoreline zoning and see if we need to do a whole.
Yeah, but I wonder if
how that's gonna
DEP
deal with
is.
it. I don't know.
Put any consideration in their rules on this.
Yeah. Oh, speaking of that, there is a new provision in shoreline zoning that deals with floodplain.
Oh, I know.
We need to.
I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is in shoreline zoning and floodplain management, there's like always an inherent conflict between like having to raise your structure above the floodplain and then height limits. So DEP finally got together with floodplain, I guess, and
Finally,
came up with some rules that allow some flexibility for that
Right.
height to be accommodated.
That's why
They changed the floodplain back in, was it 2014 or 16, it was finalized.
Yeah, but we,
Yeah.
the bait building, bait house, that was the Dodge Point, we had to flatten that roof to meet floodplain because they wouldn't let us put our building higher, but now And they use me as an example during seminars. But now they've gotten together and now there's some flexibility.
Right.
Now there is, now that we did our building. But yeah, so
Yeah.
that's
And how they
good.
interpreted the 100-year
Well, yeah,
floodplain level.
Well, also
It's gonna be
non-conformity, you know, when you
9
got a
feet or
building,
11 feet,
right?
Yeah.
But non-conformity too, you're limited.
right?
So, but now DEP's got an exception, I think. I haven't seen it yet.
yeah,
They'll have an exception with, I guess, certain, it's probably like unique case by case
Yeah.
review.
it's important, I think, with resiliency planning and things we all need to think about. There's some conflict in current shoreline zoning standards that don't allow you to plan for resiliency because there's constraints that you can't meet. Height is a big constraint.
Mhm.
Anyway, so yes,
I'm aware of that,
Yep,
yes,
yep.
thank you.
That's a good one. A couple other, we're gonna be working on, we have to make a tweak to the ordinance section 6086, which deals with, I think it's forest management, but there's a misreference to percentage, so there'll be like another handful of things like that we're working on right now. Kim's been working on a couple of definitions and some other issues that we need to deal with related to marinas and expansions of use, those kinds of things. So that's what's coming down. Individual private campsites, some clarity with that, and RVs and whatnot. So a lot of clarity, and then I think the big discussion topics would be the short-term rental ordinance, which isn't technically a land use ordinance in the sense it'll be its own standalone thing. So
Right.
We get a
Anything
couple zoning map
a
amendments.
couple zoning map amendments, one of which we've already
Two
talked
properties that are designated shoreline residential too, but they're not within 250 feet of the water. But for some reason, they're designated shoreline zoning on Peabody Drive. And two people have asked to have their zone requests changed.
So for everybody who's in attendance, the January meeting, we'll have the short-term rental stuff back on the table along with some of these other modifications. I think we'll continue to have our February meeting. Hopefully a January update to the planning board and then at least 2 public hearings in January.
So the next meeting is January 17th for the LUZO Advisory Group Committee.
January 17th.
Yeah, and we will be going to the planning board for the first time with our proposals on the 25th of January, just to give them an update of what's coming ahead of them. And to give them any opportunity to make changes, and then again on the 8th. And then the public hearing will be the 22nd of February.
So our meeting is on the 17th.
Correct.
Okay, and then the update for the planning board's on the 21st.
25th,
25th,
yeah.
okay. I thought it was 21st.
I would also say that there are other discussions that are going to be happening related to some of these topics through the warrant committee. Whenever we get in front of them, usually we do an update to the Board of Selectmen around the same time that the school does their budget update. It seems like I'm always on that meeting. I have no idea what day that is.
It says that we have to, this February 28th, CEO Planning Board LUZO has to have final articles and hearings done by.
February 28th.
I think Phil's working on the warrant committee schedule now.
Right. So that's it.
Yeah.
Nothing going on.
Cool. Good meeting.
I have a question.
Sure.
Somebody called me today asking about a deadline for getting a proposal in for some changes on their property, and I didn't know that we were actually the people they should be talking to.
You mean zoning change or?
I think a permitting, a change of use or a rebuild. I'll call you up. It's just, it didn't seem that it was something that we're responsible for dealing with. I emailed you.
Me?
It wouldn't- This committee wouldn't deal with it.
Yeah, we would,
Well-
it,
That's what I said. They claimed that today was some sort of deadline for getting
No,
getting
it-
their paperwork in, and I didn't understand it. So I just thought I'd bring it up.
if it's the one I'm thinking of, which I'm not even certain, they're coming in at the 11th hour. I told them to get it in today so we can discuss it, but they've withdrawn for right now.
Okay, it just didn't seem that it was something that we had to discuss in this committee.
Yeah, no, any rebuilds and stuff would come to me or planning board.
That's what I thought. That's what I told them, but
Yeah.
I was being harassed, so I had to deal with it.
That's great.
I was going to give him Rick's name, but I couldn't remember. So
It's all right, they wouldn't have my number.
I have.
Okay,
Yeah.
anything else we need to go over? All right. Happy holidays, everyone.
Enjoy it.
Thank you. You too.
See ya.
Oh, we will.